Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm Peggy West, the organizer, and we have a very informative presentation today by Will Simons of Association Reserves. We also have a special guest today. We have Stephen Rappaport from Sax and Kaplan on today's console. And then we also have our moderator, Daniel Baum from COA Solutions. So just want to start out by saying, if you can't make notes fast enough, this is pretty informative. You might want to take a look at that video afterward, even with your board members that have not been able to get on today, because it's a lot of some new changes, new law changes, and it's going to be a lot to review. So with that said, I want to just cover a couple of housekeeping things. Managers, you do not have to re-enter your CAM numbers into the chat box. Everybody, please use the Q&A. I wish we could remove that chat box. So please use the Q&A for all of your questions. The questions are recorded, but the chat box is not. So anything that they don't get to, Will or Steve or someone can get back to you. And if you have a question for a sponsor, you can put that in the chat box, in the Q&A box as well. And they all get copies of the entire thing. With that said, I just want to say this is a 1 hour CEU, but I always allow extra time for questions throughout. And also to board members, this is not a required class for a board certification requirement for the state of Florida. So I hope you stay on. Again, it's very informative. Board members, you do need to know this information. So let me introduce the sponsors. I'm going to start right off the bat with Vinteum Software. Vinteum, we have Fabricio on today. We have Laura on today. Can't thank you guys enough. Without them, I probably wouldn't have webinars anymore. I used to do all this, but I've gotten involved in a great partnership. So thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to ask Laura to introduce yourself and what you guys do for associations, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Peggy. My name is Laura. I am the sales executive here at Vinteum. So here at Vinteum, what we do is that we work with associations, communities, condominiums, property managers, and also property management companies. We help them have a all-in-one tool for them to be able to manage either their community or their several communities if you are a property manager or an LCAM. We have a residence portal where you guys can store documents, can conduct your board meetings, can send out communications, can send out notices for your residents, for your team. You can also, have an organized place where you can handle all the service maintenance requests, everything. And on top of that, especially in Florida, but overall in the US, we also build the websites, the public facing websites for your communities so that you once in Florida you comply to the requirement, and if you're not in Florida you still have a public facing website for those out there who want to reach out to you. We will train all of you guys. We will give ongoing support as well. So if any of you is maybe struggling with the current system you guys have, or you don't have anything yet and you would like to take advantage of the products that we're offering, we're going to send the information on the chat, and you can definitely I will definitely reach you guys out to give you more info. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So those of you that do not have a website, they are very affordable, very reasonable. And what I love about your service more than anything is that you will train the entire board individually or as a group or even the residents. So appreciate all that. Next, I want to introduce Siobhan Gonzalez. She is the representative for United Professional Engineering. Siobhan, let's hear what you have to say today.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Siobhan Gonzalez. I am the Business Development Manager here at United Professional Engineering. We are locally owned and operated. We have been serving South Florida condos for over 20 years. So our team is licensed, experienced, expertise in serving condominiums. So we really value working with association managers such as yourself, board members. We service all things, all your structural engineering needs. So that's your building recertification, milestone, phase 1, phase 2. We do concrete restoration and repair projects as well, pool deck, roof replacements, all the things. I will say that currently, one of my favorite things that we are offering and that property managers and boards are taking advantage of is our complimentary proposal consultation. So if you have a need at your association or you're not sure, especially with hurricane season being upon us, you want to be proactive. So feel free to reach out to me directly so we can discuss that more. Would love to hear from you and connect. And again, Peggy, thank you so much for putting this on and making it possible. Enjoy the webinar, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much. And I just want to add to that, they do offer an owner's representative program as well. If they are not the engineer doing your project, it's outstanding to use an engineer as an owner's rep. So that's a very great service that you guys offer. Next, I want to introduce Cameron Andres. He's with Best Roofing. Cameron, tell us about yourself and what are you guys doing for associations?
How's it going, everybody? My name's Cameron Andres. I do business development for Best Roofing. We're a commercial roofing contractor based in Fort Lauderdale, but we service all throughout the state, mainly in the southeast here. We do any kind of roofing you may need, from re-roofs to recoveries on big commercial projects, all the way down to small repairs on single-family homes. Happy to help you with anything roof-related that we possibly can. We do offer complimentary roof audits as well. So as we get into hurricane season, it might be beneficial to get somebody from Best Roofing out there, take a walk around your building, take a walk on the roof, see if there's any deficiencies we can fix before hurricane season. And that way we have a relationship. So if anything big storm-wise comes through over this hurricane season, we're there to help you immediately. So please let me know if I can help you with that.
Absolutely. Okay, great. And thank you for sponsoring. Next, I want to introduce Shawnee Haas. She's with Munyon. Tell us what's going on over there, Shawnee.
Hi, I am the marketing manager with Munyon Painting. We do residential and commercial paintings all across the state of Florida. We've been in business since 1951 and are currently third generation owned and operated. We take care of all of your painting needs, whether it's interior, exterior, electrostatic painting, pretty much everything under the sun. You can contact me and set up a free estimate. We always do free estimates and free proposals. And yeah, that's about it. And thank you, Peggy, for putting these together.
Absolutely. All right. Next, I want to introduce Damaris Cabrera. She is on today from Clarkson and Varick. These are elevator consultants. So what do you do for the industry, Damaris?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Afternoon already. My name is Damaris Cabrera. I'm the business development manager for Clarkson and Varick. We are an elevator consulting firm nationwide. We cover everywhere, very strong our market in Florida, especially because there are two codes, one that is due already and many of our associations have not met, and a new code that is going to be due in 2028. What do? We help condominium associations and all kind of buildings that have an elevator, that have issues with elevator companies, that they don't understand why they fail so often. And we create, like, what we do is we cover that gap in the knowledge. Usually our technicians and our people in the building, they don't understand. It just goes beyond their expertise. And the elevator companies are limited to their resources, to contracts that nobody understands. So what we come is we bridge that gap. We help the association to understand the contract, and we also make the contractor accountable. In this process, we have encountered that it's very important to bring up these conversations about code, about the proper, now that we have very pertinent for today's subject, to the reserves. Not all modernizations are equal. And there are components that, yes, they are designed to last 25, 20 years, but there are components that are going to be due to be replaced within the 10-year bracket, within the 5-year bracket. So it's very important to have these conversations. So we go in and we help to make these clarifications and the support for the owners. If you're not happy as an owner, an operator, our property managers, with the performance of your elevator company, and sometimes you cannot make them accountable because your contract is not appropriate. So we go in, we assess, we evaluate, and we help you to put a contract together and also to vet the contractor that is ideal for your type of equipment. So we help with that process as well. So we set that everybody up for success. So thank you very much. Thank you, Patty.
Awesome. Okay, next I want to introduce a new representative that's with Alleneck Railings. Today we have on Terry. Terry, your picture's not showing. I'm not sure why if you have the camera covered up at the top, but please tell us about yourself and Alleneck. We've really never had anybody on to explain what Alleneck does. I understand you're manufacturers, and I'm sure you do repairs, so tell us more.
Peggy, you're muted.
I'm worried about Terry being muted, and I'm muted.
Yes.
We'll come back to Terry here in case he is on to get him to speak about the company because that's a very substantial thing, especially for condominium use. And Terry being new, he probably is just getting organized here. But let me mention some of the sponsors that are not on today, just to go through them quickly. Because they are very important. Many of them had other appointments or outside things to do, but starting with PD Concrete Specialists, they are based out of West Palm Beach. They also have a second office in Aventura. They are concrete specialists, and the contact there is Daniel Pena or his son Dylan. Daniel, are you on? Or Dylan, are you on? I see you coming up.
Yeah, this is Mustafa too, the project manager with
okay.
PD. I'm available here.
Okay, great. Tell us about what's going on over there. We haven't heard from you guys in a while.
Oh yeah, it's been busy. We've been like really busy with the actual work. Everything is great here. I cannot hear you. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm trying not to talk over everybody, so I'm muting myself. I said, do you want to tell us about any special projects that you have going on or services that you're doing with the company?
Yes. So we are specialized in concrete restoration, waterproofing, post-tension cable repairs, and painting. That's our main specialty, and we provide all in-house services. We don't have a subcontractors. Everybody is working for us. We have a couple of nice jobs now with a couple of challenges in terms of shoring, mainly columns. Usually when the columns running from the garage all the way up the building, that's where we need a heavy duty shoring. And now we've been facing, maybe we got this year only, we got like about 5 jobs with real shoring challenges, and we are overcome all these challenges. So yeah, those really the good thing about this year, and we'll be happy to do like any site visit, assessment, walkthrough. Of course, no obligation, and I'll be happy to do that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Mustafa, and say hello to Daniel, please. Okay,
Thank
next
you,
I want to move into introducing City Quiet Windows and Doors. This is a long-standing sponsor for the webinars. He has 4 offices around the state and very professional. The contact there is the owner, so you might want to get a hold of Ben Friedman. I also want to mention Faster.io. This is a new streaming service, relatively new. They've been in other parts of Florida, but down here in South Florida, Bob Aleka took over here about 6 months ago. So reach out to them for a proposal if your cable service is coming up, because you can take streaming with you if you live in Canada or some other state in the country. We also have Southwest Elevators. They're also a sponsor. The contact there is 1 or 2 or 3 people. We have Brooke Cavender, her sister Brandy, and also Megan. But all these people will be on the sponsor sheet that I will send out following the class. Next, we have Hafer. This is a full-service CPA firm. Again, 4 offices around the state, very reputable. They've been around for over 15 years. Your contact there is Nicole Johnson. We also have Kaiser Air Conditioning with 2 offices on the East Coast, West Palm Beach, and then further south, I believe, in the Fort Lauderdale area. And very organized service. They have a full staff, fleet of trucks of about 100, and they are 24/7, 365 days of the year. And in Florida, that's so important. So you might catch them for a resource for air conditioning services. We also have the Paving Lady. They have a couple offices now. I think they opened up Orlando a few months ago, maybe even a year ago now. But they are full service with the paving requirements, and your contact there is Don Miller. The owner is Mauro Camuzzi. He's been in business for over 30 years. And last but not least, I want to mention a sponsor that comes and goes, but she's relatively busy with Legacy Life Plan. Her name is Dahlia Anise. She gave me a little short thing to read here. She is the Florida-based estate planning attorney and the founder of her company. She takes a heart-centered approach to the whole approach of helping families create clear, personalized plans designed to keep them out of court and out of conflict. So her work includes wills, trusts, incapacity planning, and ensuring that the client's wishes are honored. So she's available also. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Daniel Baum. Daniel, if you'll take it, he's our moderator for today, and thank you for that.
Okay, now I'm not muted. Thanks, Peggy. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Daniel Baum. I am the founder of COA Solutions of Florida. We specialize in commercial property and casualty insurance for condos, HOAs, and multifamily property. Specifically for today, when we're dealing with reserves, structural integrity, that's all has to do with the financial health of an association. And that's not abstract concepts when you talk about insurance. That's actually becoming part of the underwriting conversation every day. The reason insurance sits at the center of today's conversation is fairly simple. Reserve studies, structural integrity reserve studies, legal frameworks, they no longer just are compliance exercises. They directly impact what carriers are willing to insure, at what price, and under what terms. And a well-funded reserve properly documented engineering reports and sound legal guidance are 3 of the strongest levers that a board has to protect their community and to keep their insurance program viable, and most importantly, affordable. So that's why we've brought together all of these experts today for you to hear from. Without further ado, let me introduce both our presenter, Will Simons, as well as our legal expert, Stephen Rappaport. Will is the president of Association Reserves in Florida and the Southeast. He joined that company in 2008 after a career that spanned both the insurance and commercial real estate industries, and he established the firm's Florida office in 2011. Since then, he has personally completed or overseen more than 3,000 reserve studies across Florida and the Southeast, serving everything from luxury high-rises and timeshare resorts to large-scale HOAs representing thousands of homes, along with marinas, country clubs, and historic properties. Will holds the Community Association Institute Reserve Specialist designation RS-190. He is a CAI-educated business partner, and he's a Florida licensed continuing education provider for community association managers. If that wasn't enough, on top of all of that, he served 6 years as treasurer and vice president of his own HOA, overseeing a 600-home community with a budget north of $1 million. So he brings a rare perspective as someone who sat on both sides of the boardroom table. So please help me in welcoming Will Simons. Whenever we do a reserve study, it's always important that we bring legal representation as well. And for that reason, I'd like to introduce our second presenter or speaker today, which is Stephen Rappaport. He is an equity partner at Sachs Kaplan, one of Florida's most respected community association law firms. Stephen is a member of the firm's community association practice group, where he handles the full range of transactional matters for association clients, drafting amendments to governing documents, attending board meetings and elections, handling covenant enforcement disputes, and advising boards on virtually every issue that crosses their desk. Steve earned his JD from George Washington University Law Center and his undergraduate degree magna cum laude from the University of Florida. Go Gators. He is admitted to the Florida Bar and the District of Columbia Bar, and his service to this industry runs deep. He's a current board member of CAI's Gold Coast chapter, served on the CAI Florida Legislative Alliance for a full decade, and held leadership roles with both the South Palm Beach County Bar Association and the Palm Beach County Bar Association Community Association Law Committee. He also gives us back to the boardroom. He also gives back to the broader community through board services with AVDA, Arts Garage, and the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office Citizen Advisory Board. Please help me in welcoming Stephen Rappaport.
Thank you, Daniel.
My pleasure. So I'm going to turn the floor now over to Will, who's going to run his presentation. Just one last reminder, everyone. We do not monitor the chat throughout this conversation and this webinar. It's just too much to handle. But we do monitor the Q&A. Please put all questions about slides into the Q&A. Will and Stephen will try to address them during the course of the presentation, but if not, we will look at them all at the end at our Q&A session. I will now be quiet and turn it over to Will.
Wow, Daniel, thank you very much. Very nice intro there. And Peggy, thank you so much for putting this together. Thanks to all the sponsors. Thanks to Steve for being my co-pilot here today. Going to do our best to work through this material. I think probably should take about 45 minutes or so, and then allow plenty of time for the Q&A at the end. I guess just for a little bit of background, I've been teaching this class or kind of variations on it for probably 15 years. And what I'm going to cover today is really a very helpful introduction to the world of reserves and budgeting and reserve studies. But then we're going to kind of take a little detour in the second half and talk about the recent legislative changes that we've had in the last couple of years, specifically for the SIRS requirements. So I'll talk a lot more about that, but SIRS, just for those who are curious, SIRS is Structural Integrity Reserve Study. So that has really become the very hot topic here in the last couple of years for condos and co-ops all up and down the state. As I think we mentioned, the course is good for 1 hour of continuing education credit. So for you licensed CAMs out there, I don't think you need to flood the chat with your CAM license number, but I think Peggy already has those. But we'll work together on getting the course reporting done probably within the next couple of days, week or so, something like that. So let me dive in. I don't think I need to say much else. You guys are already very generous with the introduction. The only thing I would edit about that is now the new total for me is more than 5,000 reserve studies. I think you said 3,000. So that might be a little bit of an older bio, but everything else is the same. Yeah, I've been with the company for 18 years now. Credential reserve specialist. I oversee all of our staff and all of our clients here in Florida and some of the surrounding states. I always like to point out I am not an attorney, so everything that I say is not legal advice. That's why Steve is here. He's going to be my guardrail if I say anything wrong or that it could be said better. Between the two of us, hopefully we'll be able to steer you guys in the right direction. So let's get into, well, yeah, this is where I normally kind of highlight some of the work we do as a company. I'll just suffice to say here that what you see on the screen are kind of representations of the various properties that we work with. We, not only deal with community associations, but also private schools, churches, resorts, of course, lots of condos and HOAs, but also, country clubs, office buildings, other types of commercial facilities. So if anybody out there happens to be in a leadership position at other types of entities, reserve studies and this kind of capital planning work that we do can be extended in lots of other different directions. So I'll leave it at that for now. If you want to get more information about us as a company or me personally, our website is a great resource. It's just reservestudy.com. Pretty easy place to find. So let's kind of give you a quick overview of our staff, specifically our Florida staff. We are the largest office for our company, and our company is the largest reserve study provider in the U.S. as far as I know. Including myself, I've got 21 people on my team, very wide variety of various technical backgrounds. mostly engineering, but also architecture, construction management, business, accounting. I've always described the work that we do in a reserve study as a blend of different skill sets. So it's a little bit building sciences and kind of physical knowledge and sort of that, engineering construction mindset, knowing what to look for and what causes things to deteriorate and need to be replaced. And that's paired with the kind of financial analysis part of what we do, where we actually turn that into actionable funding plans for our clients. Thanks to those of you out there who might have voted for us over the years for the last 13 years in a row. We've been a Reader's Choice Award winner for by the Florida Community Association Journal. So thank you, and something we're very proud and hope to keep the streak alive. So let's get into the material. This is just a very high level overview of what I'm going to cover today, just so you guys can kind of follow along at home. As we said, we are going to send out copies of all these slides, and I believe we are recording now. So everything that we talk about, you'll have another chance to look over in case I go through a slide kind of quickly, or you wanted to revisit something. We'll have time in the Q&A, of course, but even after the fact, you guys can all go back and see this information again. So what I'm going to start with today are these two kind of building block sections, what are reserves, and talk a little bit about reserve studies in general. And then we'll review up until last year what have kind of been the SERS requirements in Florida, and then what changed as a result of House Bill 913, which was passed and made effective July 1st of last year. And then we'll open up the floor. So as we've said, please use that Q&A button on your Zoom taskbar. You can ask a question whenever you like. If it's a fairly simple, straightforward question, we might answer that one on the fly. Otherwise, we'll try to hold all those to the end. So let's start with our first section here. What are reserves? So if you've been in this industry for a while, if you're a board member, a manager, this is going to be a pretty basic overview, but there may be some folks out there who are totally new to this stuff. And so we'll start with kind of this very elementary concept. When you're talking about an annual budget for an association, you can categorize that really into two broad sections. So the first section we're going to talk about is the operating fund. Now, operating money is really there for the routine costs of running the business of the association. These are the daily, weekly, monthly expenses, things like utilities and payroll and insurance and preventive maintenance and so on and so forth. Sometimes I use an analogy here, kind of personal finance analogy. The operating account for an association is kind of like a checking account for a person or a family, right? This is where you pay for your groceries, your car payment, your Amazon purchases, right? Just all the day-to-day stuff that you use to manage your life. With regard to associations, operating funds are unrestricted. So that means you can spend this money on anything that you need to. It is kind of free for the association to use. Typically, you will spend this money in the same year that you've collected it. So the idea there is that if you've designed a very good, accurate budget, you shouldn't have a huge surplus or deficit at the end of the year. You kind of collect what you need, you pay those bills, and you roll forward into the next year. Now, that's different in some important ways from the reserve fund. Okay, so reserve funds, these are there for the long-term, big ticket items that associations have to pay for. Sometimes these may not happen for 5 or 10 or 25 years at a time, but when they do, these can be some of the biggest bills your association will ever have to pay. So this is going to be things like roof replacements, painting and waterproofing, pavement resurfacing, elevator mods, right? Some of the stuff that you guys heard mentioned in the opening remarks from our sponsors today, right? These are the big items that associations have to pay for. This is why you have reserve money. In contrast, from the operating budget, reserve money is meant to accumulate, right? It's okay to build up that account balance over many years at a time, so that by the end of the lifespan of your assets, you've accumulated enough money to go out and replace them. Reserve money is restricted, okay? So that means once you've put $1 into a reserve account, it is now designated for a particular purpose. You can't just go and spend that money however you like. It is limited and strictly for a specific purpose. And there's different variations on this. There's something called straight line reserves versus pooled reserves. I'm not really going to get into the weeds on that during the presentation. Maybe if we have time during the Q&A, if people want a quick discussion on that. But for now, suffice to say that, kind of in that personal finance analogy, reserve funds are more like a specialty savings account, maybe like a college funding plan or a retirement account would be for a family, right? It's money that you're dedicating on an ongoing basis for this eventual, big expenditure that you're going to have down the road. So let's now talk about the kind of Florida statutes, right? This is a very short excerpt that we've pulled from Statute 718, what we call the Condo Statute. And what I've highlighted in red here, this is the portion of that statute that talks about what associations must be reserving for. So if you look this over here, you'll see that the statutes require 3 things in particular, and then one sort of general definition at the end. Okay, so the 3 things in particular, you can see there: roof replacement, building painting, and pavement resurfacing. And then any other item with a replacement cost exceeding $25,000. And you see what I try to do here. Up until last year, that number was 10,000. So that is now increased. The state of Florida, after decades of setting 10,000 as the bar, has raised that number to 25,000. Now, we'll just a quick aside on that. I don't know that that's a great idea for most associations, especially your small to medium-sized associations out there. You probably want to set that cost threshold at a significantly lower number than that. The idea is that if you are ignoring, your $10,000 to $15,000 projects and just assuming your operating budget can absorb those when they come along, if you get into a bad situation where a couple of those things all happen at the same time, you might be pinched for cash, right? And so the idea of including more things in your reserve schedule, I think, is an advantage. That means you're tracking those all along and you're not relying on your operating budget to absorb those surprises whenever you can. Okay. This next slide here, this is a short, even shorter excerpt of Statute 720. This is for HOAs. Really has even less to say than the condo statute. There is no specific checklist for HOAs. Basically just says that, there are certain things in your community that you're responsible for, and if you don't have reserves, that might result in a special assessment. That's really the one thing that we're all trying to avoid, right? Special assessments or bank loans that are unnecessary, right? For things that are otherwise very routine and predictable. Your game plan, your plan A, should not be just special assessing your owners whenever those things come along. That's a very inefficient, ineffective, and I would argue unfair way of doing things. So for now, we'll just keep this as kind of our general sort of basic definition. Okay, reserve money is there for an association to save over a long period of time for major repairs and replacements. Okay, now there's a couple things that I'm not saying, right? I did not say that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements, on paying your insurance deductible, or really any other purpose. Now, there are cases where that's permitted, but that should not be your default approach. So I'll give you a quick example on kind of the capital improvement concept. Let's say there's an association out there that does not have a playground, but they really, think that would be a good addition to the community. Maybe there's a lot of kids and grandkids running around, and maybe the owners are all in favor of it. They say, we would love to take some empty space and put in a playground. That's fine, but you can't use reserve money for that. The reason is that is adding a new element to the association, right? It's an improvement that wasn't there before. And any of the existing reserve money that was set aside in prior years was done specifically for the repair and replacement of the existing assets, not considering the addition of new ones. So it might be a great thing to do, and maybe they want to add value to the community by putting in that new amenity. But the initial cost of installing it, the construction of the playground, should be paid for by some other means, right? Maybe that's a separate savings fund or a surplus from the operating budget or even special assessment. Now, if they do that, right, if the community does put that playground in place, by all means, from then on, they should be adding new reserve line items for the equipment, the shade structure, the fall surface, the fencing, whatever the constituent elements of that playground are. It's just that initial outlay that should not be treated as a reserve expenditure. Okay. So, like I said, I'm going to try to move through these first two sections because these are, I think, fairly basic. But the next one we're going to talk about are reserve studies, kind of some of the high level concepts and terminology about what you get from a reserve study. So the first thing I'll do is just establish the definition of the term. Okay, so this definition of a reserve study comes from reserve study standards, which were put in place in the late 90s by CAI. Okay, if you're not familiar with CAI, it's the Community Associations Institute. Really, really powerful organization. They've got chapters all across the US and now internationally. And CAI is kind of the governing body that oversees a lot that goes on in the community association world. So credentialing standards for managers, for reserve specialists, for insurance professionals. There's a lot of vendors and professionals that are part of CAI. It's a great kind of sounding board and resource for board members. So if anybody's curious about that, I think we've got 8 chapters in Florida now. There's tons of resources online and vendor directories, things like that. So CAI really created this definition back in the late 90s. It basically says that a reserve study is a tool. It's a document, but it's a tool that does a couple of important things. First of all, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And then secondly, it provides a funding plan that gives guidance about how to deal with future expenditures. Okay, so again, a reserve study is a specific type of document. It is not the same thing as an insurance appraisal or a milestone inspection or a turnover study or any other type of engineering report. Okay, it is a very particular document that contains very specific content about both the physical and the financial elements of the community. So as I said, kind of in the beginning here, a reserve study is a blend of different things. In this case, we're talking about the physical health and how that affects the financial health of your association. Okay, there's 2 parts to a reserve study, what we call the physical analysis and then the financial analysis. Again, kind of staying on the same theme. The physical analysis part of the job, this is where somebody comes out to do that on-site physical visual inspection of all the common areas of the property. So this is going to be everything from top to bottom, from the roof all the way down to the mechanical rooms, the amenities, the parking structure, the gym, the lobby, right? Everything that the association has and is responsible for is something that needs to be evaluated. This process usually involves a lot of kind of detailed work, a lot of measurements, photos, but also documenting things like model numbers and serial numbers for equipment, basically gathering all of the raw data about the physical assets of the community, what we will eventually use to turn that into a component list and then define their funding plan. But when we're doing this physical analysis part, it's usually very, very helpful and worthwhile to have collaboration with the association. So that can be a board member or the whole board or property manager or the building engineer. The idea is we love to work with you guys to hear from you about, what are your concerns, what's not working at the property, are you spending a ton of money on repairs for certain elements, right? Help us kind of piece together the history of the property so that we have more information going into the process we do of estimating life expectancies and replacement costs. The second part of that is the financial analysis. So that's everything that takes place after the inspection, back at the office, sitting at the computer, organizing all of that data, researching costs with your vendors and suppliers, finding out when you last did things and what that cost you, kind of gathering as much information as we can about the financial history of the property. And there we kind of turn that into the action steps, right? The actual financial recommendations and conclusions for you. So I like to say there are 2 parts to that process, but really 3 outcomes, 3 questions that we will help you answer when we do a reserve study. So the first one is, what do you have, right? What exists at your property? What conditions are things in? Then where do you stand financially? And then the third part is where do you go from here? So kind of in that order, we'll talk first about the component list. Right, so this is just a listing of all the individual items or assets that the association is responsible to maintain. We provide a couple of values for each of those items. So there's going to be a useful life assessment, a remaining useful life, and then a replacement cost. And the kind of coordination of those 3 items gives us a timeline of future expenditures, right? If my useful life tells me kind of the overall interval, the overall lifespan for each item, the remaining useful life will be fixed as of a particular fiscal year, say 2027. And then the replacement cost is used to tell us, okay, if you had to do this work today, what would that cost you? But very importantly, we build in an inflation assumption to try to figure out, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, what will this cost look like, really? And that's that moving target that we're trying to help you shoot for. So the three things that we care about there, again, being useful life, remaining life, and cost. Now, there are some industry standard definitions of what belongs in a reserve study. Okay, so we showed earlier very briefly the Florida statutes and kind of their little checklist, but there's a much more broad criteria that we use when we're going into a property for the first time. So it's very simple. It's three tests. One, is it the association's responsibility? Two, does it have a limited and predictable lifespan? And three, does it have a significant replacement cost, right? We don't care about light bulbs and sprinkler heads, for example. But if a component of the property meets those three definitions, then really it should belong in your reserve plan. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is this notion of where do you stand financially? And the metric that we use to establish that is something called percent funded. So you can think of percent funded, like we say here, is basically taking a snapshot in time of the financial health of the community, right? We're going to look at how much cash do you have compared against how much you should have, and use that to estimate or approximate a kind of measurement of financial strength. Okay. And I'll say more about that here on this next slide. One of the best ways that I've found to explain this concept of percent funded is to compare it to something like a credit score for an association, right? Everybody here today has had their credit report pulled. Maybe some of you know offhand what your score is, but you understand the concept, right? To an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, that score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are, right? So in the same way, if you think of your reserve study, kind of like a credit report for the association, but you have to distill that down to one key result, right? One metric, then I would say that should be your percent funded. So we measure it on this kind of 0 to 100% scale here. We consider anything from 0 to 30% funded to be a weak position. So what we mean there is a high likelihood of special assessments or loans for things that are going to happen at the property. From 30 to 70% funded, this kind of middle band is more of a mid-range or moderate position. It's not an emergency anymore, but maybe there's still some room for improvement here. Where you really want to be is above 70% funded, right? Obviously, 100% is the center of the bullseye, but anything above 70% funded, we see a very low correlation of special assessment history or future risk of special assessment. So that's really what you want to be shooting for. So what we're going to do now is just kind of dive in on this concept a little bit more and talk about how do we calculate this figure, right? And it's pretty straightforward. We look at how much money you have compared against how much money you should have, right? It's as simple as that. This divided by this equals your percent funded. So, no, wrong way. There we go. So the way that I have always tried to characterize this is by zooming in on that second number, how much money you should have. This is something that we call the fully funded balance, right? And it's a theoretical number telling us, in a perfect world, how much money should you have set aside for all of your assets? So I'll give you a very brief example here. Let's say we're talking about a golf cart, and let's make it a very fancy golf cart, $10,000. And let's say that it's going to last for 10 years. Okay. At any point in the life of that golf cart, we can figure out how much money should this association have saved up to that point. And that number, whatever that number is, how much they should have saved, would be their fully funded balance at that point in time. So let's say we ignore inflation for the moment, okay? $10,000 over 10 years means you're putting aside ideally $1,000 a year so that at the end of 10 years, you've got enough money to go buy a new golf cart. So if I want to stop at any point, let's say it's 4 years old, and I want to figure out, well, how much money should we have today? That number would be $4,000. right? It's 4 years out of 10. It's 4/10 of the way through its life. So you should have about 40% of its replacement cost, which would be $4,000. So if the association at that point in time looked at their balance sheet and said, we have $4,000 in the bank, they are 100% funded. They are fully funded. Okay, so even though they don't have the full $10,000 replacement cost, that's okay. They don't need it at that stage, right? It's only 40% of the way through its life. So at the same time, if they only had $2,000 in the bank, they are 50% funded. They're half of where they should be. Okay, so I like to kind of just, talk this through because we put this sort of theoretical question on there. If I told you that there's some association out there with $50,000 or 500,000 or 5 million in reserves, and you don't know anything else about the property, is that meaningful? Right? Of course not. We need to know how old is it? How many components do they have? What are those ages? What are those costs? Right? This is really the heart of a reserve study, is calculating that need. How much money should they have? And from there, we can come up with an estimate of strength, right? By comparing their actual cash balance against that benchmark. Okay, so our first outcome, remember, our first question that we answered is, what do you have? The second one is, where do you stand financially? We answer that with percent funded. The third question to answer, where do we go from here, is where we get into our funding plan, right? So here's where we look at the future timeline of expenses. The very first thing we do actually is to look at how much money the association is budgeting currently, right? Let's just model that out. If you just kept doing what you're doing, will that be enough long term? Will you stay above zero? Will you reach the targets you're trying to hit? If so, great, then stick with that plan. The vast majority of the time, though, associations are not doing enough. And so we have to come in and make some recommendations. The second part that I put in here, matching the frequency of your regular assessments, this is to point out that reserve funding is not a reactive, whatever's left over kind of approach. If you have monthly dues in your association, you need to have a monthly reserve transfer. I believe by law, and Steve, you can check me on this, I think it's within 30 days that has to be made.
Yeah.
Thank you. And same with quarterly. If you have quarterly dues, you can have a quarterly reserve contribution. What you can't do, though, is just operate throughout the year and just hope that you've got enough money at the end, transfer a little bit on December 31st and say, look, we funded reserves. That's a very reactive, kind of hopeful approach, not actually a strategy. Okay. So when we are designing a funding plan, we're trying to check a couple of different boxes here. So first and foremost, the funding plan cannot demonstrate that the association will run out of money, which should seem pretty obvious, but we're looking out at a 30-year timeline and we're saying, okay, you're starting with this amount in the bank. Here's how much you're going to spend. So at minimum, how much do we need to be adding to this reserve account so that you stay above zero, right? That's something that we call baseline funding, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation here. But that's first and foremost, the absolute minimum. Because if you go below zero in your forecast, you are guaranteed to need a special assessment or a loan to make up the shortfall, which is, again, something we're trying to avoid. What I say here about being distributed amongst all the components, what that means is that you fund everything all the time, right? You don't take years off. As soon as you've replaced a roof, you immediately begin funding reserves for the next roof replacement cycle. The advantage of doing that is that you spread the cost over the entire lifespan of the asset, right? That way, everybody who comes and goes, everybody who lives in that property will be paying towards that cost, right? It doesn't, in other words, just fall on the shoulders of the unlucky group of people who live there when the roof finally fails and they pay a special assessment and buy a new one, right? That means they're basically picking up the tab for everybody who came before them, which is something that should be avoided. Okay, we want to have a stable contribution rate. What that means is you should not have a huge yo-yo effect, right? The tail doesn't wag the dog. You don't fund a bunch of money in reserves one year because you have a big project and then drop it back down and back up again and back down, right? It is normal and appropriate to have some kind of, inflationary increase each year, right? You bump up your reserve number by a couple percentage points each year to keep up with inflation. That's very appropriate. but it should not be peaks and valleys. Okay, the last part is it's got to be fiscally responsible. So realistic assumptions for interest and inflation, not, putting lipstick on a pig, not kicking the can down the road, right? We deal with a lot of associations, probably the majority of our association clients that are in a less than desirable financial position, let's say. And a lot of the time that's because prior memberships, prior boards might have waived the reserves or did partial funding, kind of just put it off for some other group. And here we are in 2026. There's quite a lot of associations that, have found themselves in a difficult financial position. That is no excuse to just kick the can down the road for the next group, right? Every board member out there has a fiduciary duty to their association to act in the best interests of the corporation, which is not always, necessarily the popular vote, right? That's not what everybody's going to want to hear, but it remains your fiduciary duty to put together a good financial plan, to be honest about the position that you're in, and draft an appropriate budget for the future. So, all right. I think we're about halfway through. Steve, how am I doing? Anything you would correct so far?
No, nothing to correct. The only thing I would want to hit where you talked about the SERS at the very beginning is, one of the key things about the SERS reserves is that you cannot waive or reduce even with a membership vote. But one thing that seems to never be really a big topic of discussion is the change that they made to the non-SERS reserves. It used to be that the non-SERS reserves, you could waive or reduce them by a vote of a majority of the quorum. So you would just have to establish a simple quorum and get a majority of those voting in person or by proxy to waive the non-SERS reserves. They've changed that to now make it a majority of the entire voting interest. So kind of a big deal that even for the reserves that are waivable or reducible, you now have this higher threshold vote that you have to obtain.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And even though they've raised that threshold, I would still say that Florida is unique in the sense that, we're a nationwide company. We've got clients in all 50 states. To my knowledge, Florida is the only state where the membership has ever had that vote or still can have it, right? Everywhere else that we operate, the board sets the budget and that's it. There is no, the board sets a budget and then the members can vote not to fund the reserves. And what's interesting is the members can't vote on anything else like that. They can't vote not to pay the insurance bill, right? They can't vote not to pay the electric bill. But for whatever reason, this loophole has existed for a long time that's given the membership that option, which is really not a good idea. But yeah, so let's kind of dive in now to the Sears specific part of the presentation. Quick, recap here of what's happened in the last couple of years. So the first iteration of the Sears requirements and the milestone inspection requirements came about in 2022, just about a year after the Champlain Towers South collapse in 2021. Senate Bill 4D was kind of the initial introduction of this concept. For those that, were kind of following along at that time, that was kind of a very, very confusing piece of legislation, I think, for a lot of people, right? The initial bill had things like foundations in the study requirements, saying that you would need to come up with a number for, in theory, replacing the foundation of your building, which is pretty much practically impossible. So fortunately, a year later, Senate Bill 154 really clarified and improved a lot of the requirements, made these things a lot more practical to follow. That's the first year when you started to have mass adoption of this concept, a lot more providers coming into the space to offer the Sears. So beginning kind of late 2023 and into 2024, this was really the peak of this kind of fever pitch. House Bill 1021 came along in the year 2024, didn't change a lot of the underlying Sears requirements. It did add some new reporting requirements and requirements for board members, but no major overhaul at that point to the existing Sears requirement. Then we got House Bill 913 passed, made effective July 1st of last year, which did have some meaningful changes, which we'll talk about. Since then, nothing has happened, right? We just finished our legislative session in March for this year. I believe the governor has announced a special session. So the Florida legislators will be going back to Tallahassee, but I don't believe there's been any talk about any further bills that would affect anything up to now. So as of now, House Bill 913 is kind of the most recent law of the land. I'll just do a quick overview on this. This is, just the legal definition of a SIRS. You guys can all read this on your own time. We'll provide the slides to everybody. The only thing I want to highlight here is that if you take out the words structural integrity and you read the rest of this, you're talking about a reserve study just like has been defined for decades, right? It's a physical and financial analysis of a property based on a visual inspection by a qualified professional to help the client make sure they're saving enough money to take care of the place, right? So this was not a revolutionary concept. The only thing that they did here was kind of zero in on the need for structural integrity, kind of understandably because of the tower collapse. This slide here is talking about what is included in the requirements. So some of these are pretty straightforward, roof replacement, fireproofing and fire protection. But there's some nuance to this list. Structure here does not mean that you need to be funding to rebuild your building, right? You're not funding for the entire bones of your high-rise building, right? It's typically going to be an interpretation of this would be an allowance for concrete restoration, for structural repairs. Usually every 7 to 10 years, you're doing a painting and waterproofing cycle. That is the perfect time to budget some extra money for concrete work at your property. So that's usually what they mean by structure. Plumbing and electrical, again, not very well defined here. It's kind of open to the interpretation of the provider as to what those things constitute. Windows and exterior doors are limited only to the ones the association is responsible for. I had a good call with a client yesterday who was concerned that they might have to fund, $20 million for replacing every window and door in the property. That's not the case. If your declaration says that the unit owner is responsible, then you're only focusing on the common area, windows and doors. Maybe it's your lobby and places like that. Similar change took place here, the increase from 10,000 to 25,000 on letter H. This is basically saying that there are other things at your property that if you don't maintain or replace could negatively affect something else on this list. So to me, the best example of something that meets this definition are like the balcony railings on a balcony, right? Those are embedded into the slab, and if you fail to maintain them or waterproof them, they can corrupt or compromise the concrete structure, right? So by that definition, they would become a structural reserve element, okay? Mostly, though, other than that, the requirements have not changed a whole lot, right? So just to give everybody the overview, this requirement is applicable to the entire state, all 67 counties of Florida. It is required for all condos and co-ops that are 3 or more stories in height. There's a couple of exceptions there. We could now add something to say 3 or more habitable stories. And it also would exclude dwellings where you have 4 or fewer units per building. So if you have, 4 units in one building and 4 units in another, and each building is separate from the other one, they are not required to get a SIRS done. It still is based on a visual inspection, and it has to be reported to the Florida DBPR within 45 days. Okay. So what did change, right? These from now on, everything that changed last year is going to be what I talk about. Now, what I did, just to give everybody a quick kind of shortcut, down at the bottom here, you see a source, and I think we'll maybe provide this with the follow-up email. I'll just attach a complete copy of House Bill 913. It's like 191 pages long. But what I did here is I gave you the page number and the lines specifically that are the source material for everything that I'm going to talk about. So if you want to check me on this, please feel free to use that cheat sheet. But the first thing to highlight here is that the deadline has passed. Okay, so if you're in a building out there that is 3 or more stories and you have not done your SIRS, you are in violation of Florida statute. Okay, the original deadline was December 31st of 2024. Last year, they extended that by a year to December 2025. There has been no further discussion about additional extensions. So I know just based on the SEERS reporting data we've seen from the DBPR, there's probably at least 10,000 buildings in the state of Florida that have not reported completion of the SEERS. And one of the things I'll talk about at the end is kind of the additional compliance that's going to be enforced here. Something, kind of subtle change here, something that originally it said any person qualified could do the SEERs as long as the visual inspection was performed or verified by an engineer, architect, RS, or PRA. Nowadays, they've removed that first part. So now a board member or manager cannot do their own SEERs. It has to be fully prepared by one of these professionals. There's some new language here about transparency and conflicts of interest. Okay, so there's a lot of engineering firms out there that have kind of gotten into this space recently and started offering SEERs reserve studies. That's fine. But if they intend to also bid on anything else for that building, such as a project, owner representation fee or a project management fee or concrete restoration, they need to disclose that in advance to the association, because there could arguably be a conflict of interest there if they're using a relatively low cost SEERs as the springboard to a fee for a project that's much more than that. Okay, one of the biggest focuses last year was on financial flexibility. I think there was a lot of angst and anxiety about the financial impact to communities from these SEERs requirements. So they last year built in some new measures that are supposed to give a little bit of flexibility there. So the first one is that associations can now incorporate loans, lines of credit, or special assessments to fund for their SEERs components. But there's an important caveat. That funding must be immediately available to the board without further approval by the members. So in other words, a board can't just say, you know what, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We'll get a loan in the future when we have to do our next roof replacement. That is not a substitute for funding SEERs in the budget. Now, if they've already got the loan, if they've already got the special assessment, and that's a done deal, then they can tell their SEERs provider, look, we have these other funds available. We're going to use those first, design our funding plan based around that assumption. And that's okay. All right. A big one here that a lot of people are asking about these days, how can we pause our reserve funding? So again, a lot of text on the screen, but I'll give you the overview. If you're in a property that has completed a milestone inspection within the last 2 years, and that inspection discovered some substantial repairs that need to be dealt with, you can take a majority vote of the owners to pause your SEERs reserve funding for the next 2 budgets. That will go away. That only applies to budgets adopted before the end of 2028, but that may be some financial relief to some communities out there. Another wrinkle on this is that when that association then goes to resume that reserve funding, they have to get a new SEERs done to show what their new funding plan looks like, right? So you can take the pause, assuming you meet these criteria, then you need to do basically a new financial checkup to see where you stand and what you need to do going forward. Okay, again, on the theme of financial relief, one of the arguments we've heard for many years about, why we don't want to fund reserves is because we feel, right, we being the association, we feel that we can get a better return on our money if we just leave it in our own portfolios, right? We'll write a special assessment check if we have to. Associations can't get a very, attractive return on their invested money. So this new language has been added that says a board shall use best efforts to make prudent investment decisions that carefully consider risk and return. So to me, this is opening a little bit more daylight for associations maybe to work with an investment advisor, come up with a plan that gets a better return on your invested funds. This is still very new. I have not seen widespread adoption of this yet, but hopefully this will be some relief to some buildings. If you've got, long-term projects that are way out in the future and you can afford to take a little bit more risk along the way, there might be some new investment options for you out there. So I would say talk to your bank, to an investment advisor. Maybe they have some attractive programs you might look into. Okay, got about maybe 5 or 6 slides left here, but some important things to cover here. When do you have to update your SEERs? Okay, so initially the requirement was at least once every 10 years, but I would argue here that's only if you're sticking with the plan. Okay, so nowadays, if you have a SEERs that was performed before you've subsequently obtained these alternate funding sources, such as a loan or a line of credit, you now would need to update your SEERs to show that your financial picture has changed, right? Now you've got this new money available to you that you didn't have before. That's fine, but you need to get a new SEERs done before you can adopt a new budget. Lastly, it also says a new SEERs is required before any budget in which the funding plan does not align with the most recent SEERs. It is not very helpful in the statute to define what it means by not aligned with. Me and some other providers have kind of put our heads together and working with the DBPR now about some criteria for how to establish that. But the biggest, most obvious example would be if you had a SEERS done in 2023 or 2024, and it required some funding in, say, 24 or 25, and you chose to waive that reserve, which you could have done if you passed the budget before the end of 24, that would have been allowed, but from now on, you're not in alignment, okay? The way I like to explain this is to say, let's say I'm putting together a plan for you to drive from Miami to Jacksonville. Now, if I told you to leave at a certain time and drive a certain speed, and we had a traffic report and we could see what the obstacles are going to be along the way, I have a reasonably good prediction about when you're going to arrive. Now, let's say you skipped the first part of the plan. You started a few hours late, right? Well, now that plan's not going to work anymore. You're not in alignment with the prior assumptions. You're not going to end up at the same place at the same time. So that would mean you've got to come up with a new plan based on the fact that you started later. Okay, same goes for reserve funding. If you wait a while or if you skipped step 1 and step 2, you're going to have to come up with a new plan to get caught back up. Okay, I touched on this a little bit earlier, this concept of baseline funding. So this term has been in existence for quite a long time with CAI. Basically, it just means that your proposed funding of reserves must keep you above zero. Anything above zero is considered sufficient here. The terminology didn't exist in the statute before, so now they have specifically named it what it is. It's called baseline funding. The technical requirement didn't change here. It's just an alignment with the existing industry terms, which is very helpful. Okay, a couple last things here. The reporting requirements. So within 45 days of getting your SEERs, you've got to do a couple things. First, you have to distribute a copy or make it available to all of your owners. You've also got to report it to the DBPR, and there is now an online database for doing so. The third thing that's new this past year is that now an officer or director must sign an affidavit acknowledging receipt of that. So that is an additional kind of legal requirement, but an important one. Now, some people have asked me, how do we get that affidavit? And I was on a task force last fall working with the DBPR to try to come up with a standardized form. To my knowledge, that hasn't been made public yet, but it should be probably any week now. In the meantime, I would, I guess, Steve, we'd talk to an attorney, have them draft a pretty straightforward affidavit, probably a one-pager, just saying, we got our SEERs on this date, and here's our signature, and we're good, right? Yeah. Okay, the last really important thing to talk about is, I touched on earlier, this expanded enforcement. Okay, so the top red paragraph here, this was in the statute before. As of Senate Bill 154, it stated, if the officers or directors of an association willfully and knowingly fail to complete their SERS pursuant to this paragraph, that failure is a breach of their fiduciary duty. Now, what does that mean? If you're in breach of fiduciary duty, that can jeopardize a lot of things for your property. First and foremost, for the board members, that might mean that your D&O coverage does not protect you. Okay, so you might be exposed to personal liability for your actions as a board member if you're in breach. That also can make it very difficult to get insurance or to get lending, right? If you are publicly identified as not having completed this requirement, and I think this extends to the milestone inspections as well, that's a bad situation to be in. So that was already there. The new thing that got added is the second part. The division may impose a civil penalty individually against an officer or board member who willfully and knowingly fails to do this requirement, up to $5,000. Okay, so that to me was the stick, right? Last year we had the carrot of all these new forms of financial flexibility, trying to make it easier for associations to comply with the law. They extended the deadline, right? I think the state was saying, look, we get it. This was a big lift to begin with, so we're going to give you guys some more options for how to do it. On the other hand, If you're still dragging your feet, if you're still not complying, we have this option to fine you. And not just fine you, they can also remove a board member from their position on the board and prevent them from rejoining the board. So some pretty steep penalties that could befall board members who are out of compliance. All right, so my last really talking slide here is just trying to bring it home with a little bit of a positive light. This is the new normal, right? There is no going back, right? Associations, as Steve mentioned earlier, must now fund reserves for your Sears components. There's not an option to not do that anymore. And this applies to every building in the state, right? So this is not a penalty, it's not a punishment. It is closing a financial loophole that existed for a long time. A lot of people have asked me, well, what's the net financial impact to owners in an association as a result of this? And I would say ultimately there is no change. Because guess what? If you didn't have any of these SIRS requirements, roofs will still fail, concrete will still deteriorate, buildings still need to be painted, fire alarm systems go obsolete. You would still have to pay for all this stuff. So those same owners who are saying, well, we can't afford the new budget increase because of Sears, how would those same people be able to afford the loan or the special assessment, which would be coming down the line, right? So I think that's a kind of a false premise that associations cannot afford this. They were always going to have to pay for this stuff one way or another. So I think one of the important things to do here is to communicate that well, right? That's why we're doing this webinar here today. It's why we've been publishing blog posts and, going on podcasts and kind of getting the word out about this stuff now for years. And lastly, I think that there are some positives to it, right? Associations that have suffered through, multiple rounds of special assessments or have had, loans sitting on their balance sheet for forever because they never had reserves. Hopefully those days will come to an end. If you have a healthy reserve fund and you are contributing the right amount each year, everybody's paying their fair share. And that doesn't befall, like I said, the unlucky group who happen to be the ones to pick up the tab for everybody else. So to me, it may feel like a thin silver lining, but after this period of adjustment, which may take us, a couple more years, I think this is a really important thing for Florida properties long term. So that is all I've got. Got my email address here on screen. I'll leave that up for a moment. But Peggy or Steve, how do you want to start tearing through Q&A?
You want to tackle the questions in the Q&A?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just kind of go from the top. I mean,
Yeah,
you guys.
and this may include Steve probably more than he necessarily expects. Um, so I'll let you decide if you want to handle this. What I'd like to do is, Barry, thank you very much for your input. You always have a lot to offer. You have quite a few questions that you've put into the mix. I would like to give some of our non-attorneys an opportunity to ask their questions. So Will and Stephen, I'll leave it to you, but I think maybe we deal with some of the community members' questions and then come back to Barry's later, or however you see fit.
I think that's good approach. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that could work, and it looks like a lot of Barry's questions relate to this the Fannie Mae type of stuff, and it might be worth spending a couple minutes talking about that. Although that's certainly something that could be a topic of its own hour-long webinar. But
Yeah.
I want to address the first question, which talks about the loan and the line of credit, because you mentioned that in one of your slides. I don't know the answer as to whether it's a wise choice. I'll defer to the banking people on a question like that. I'm not even sure if there are banking options
Steve,
yet.
just mention the question first, because not everyone.
Not everyone sees it. It says our condo management company has suggested that a bank line of credit be obtained to cover reserves as required. Is this a wise choice? Would it satisfy the legislation? I mean, I think it's clear that the legislation contemplates, as Will was saying, the ability to enter into a loan or a line of credit. Whether it's a wise choice, that I don't know the answer to. But the curious thing that I do want to point out is that the way the statute's worded, at least my reading of it, is it requires a majority vote of the membership to enter into that loan or line of credit. And the question that I always have when I'm giving board certifications or talking about this topic is, what if I have a declaration of condominium that doesn't require a membership vote to enter into a loan or a line of credit? Many of my condo associations have language under the powers and duties of the board of directors that just says to enter into loans or to borrow money, and it doesn't talk about requiring a membership vote. This statute is a good statute if my documents require a 2/3 vote to enter into a loan, because now I can say, okay, well, rather than having to get a 2/3 vote for a loan for this specific purpose. The statute's allowing me to get there with a majority vote. But if I have a declaration that doesn't require a membership vote at all, is this affirmatively requiring me to now go out and get a majority vote of the membership to do something that I otherwise wouldn't have had to get their approval for in the first place? And I think the answer is yes. So that's something I think when you're getting into applying for these loans or lines of credit to discuss with your association counsel to review your documents and to give you an opinion as to whether or not you can go with the documents or whether you have to comply with the statute now. And I think the answer is you have to comply with the statute.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that a line of credit might be a useful tool, but I would say in addition to just a healthy budgeted reserve amount, right? A line of credit should not be the first line of defense against this spending. These things are inevitable and predictable, and it's very much in your best interest to put that money aside. A line of credit might fill in the gaps, right? Or help you bridge the timeline. If you're new to reserve funding and trying to build up this account balance, it's going to take you some time. A line of credit might be a good short-term backup plan, and then maybe you hold on to that line for the future, but not as a replacement for reserve funding.
Peggy, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I just wanted to say that one of our sponsors is Jamie Gelfand from First Citizens Bank that I think I forgot to mention, but she is an expert on this. I tell you, she's a 30-year prior property manager, regional manager, and went into banking probably about maybe another 5 years or so ago. And if you have any questions at all about this, she will speak to you, even if you're not her banker. So Jamie will be on the sheet to give you some information about, the positives and the negatives about the loan process itself. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Somebody also did comment in the chat or in the Q&A saying the banks are now requiring a vote by members. So maybe that's becoming more commonplace for the banks to have their own standards there.
Okay, Denise asks, would the landscape budget be used each year as operating expense or reserve?
To me, that's a classic operating expense. Landscaping, maintenance, repair, cutting grass, fertilizing, tree trimming, all the routine stuff that you do to maintain your landscaping is pretty much always an operating expense. In some cases, you might have a reserve component as well. Maybe if it's like every 5 years, you want to do a really substantial improvement or refresh or rejuvenation, or maybe you have certain trees that only get trimmed on a certain timeline. It is possible to have reserve funds for landscaping as well, but the vast majority of that cost, I think, is in the operating budget.
Yeah. Completely agree. And I think there was just a follow-up question about would that include sod replacement? And I think the answer is the same. It's an operating expense unless you voluntarily put in a reserve for lawns, landscaping, sod replacement, or something like that, which you have the right to do. It's not obligated, but I think it depends on how you've collected it.
Yeah.
Right. I think the story that I'm hearing from you guys is essentially the reserves are exactly that, right? The idea is to put the money aside over the course of several years so it's available to use for these purposes. It's not a penalty to homeowners to take money out of their pocket. It's just a prudent financial tool to make sure money is available when you want to use it for these items in your community. Some things are mandated by the state because we want to make sure that they're reserved for, and some things aren't, but that doesn't mean you couldn't reserve for those things if the board and the community feels it's worthwhile, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Philip asks, what's the ideal multiple of monthly expenses that we need to keep in operating funds?
Yeah, I've heard different schools of thought on this. I think the smallest number I've heard is 2 or 3 months. More like 6, I think, is ideal, especially if your association carries a lot of bad debt. If you've got people that are slow to pay, or if you got kind of a more volatile, expense profile, then maybe you're trending towards that 6 months of worth of expenses. Anything more than that might be considered a little bit excessive, but.
Okay. Steve, you have any opinion on that?
No, that sounds fair to me.
Okay. Moving along, Anne, can anticipated interest income be included in reserve funding coverage?
Yes. Absolutely can and should, right? So whatever you're earning in interest, every dollar you get paid by a bank is a dollar you don't have to collect from your owners. So when we do a study, we do model in whatever your interest earnings assumption is, and that is part of the cash flow going into the community. So we definitely do take that into account.
Great. Carlton asks, does the affidavit need to be notarized? I presume that's the affidavit for the board members.
I don't believe so.
Yeah, I don't believe so. I don't know 100% off the top of my head, but I don't believe it's absolutely required. But I would have to see the form again just to verify that.
Okay. Guillermo asks, we are currently modernizing the elevators and we will be finished in 2027. Do we need to include elevator reserves for 2027 budget, or should we then start including it in 2028 budget, I guess, for the next time they're
Yeah.
going to have to do the elevators?
Sure. So here's what we typically do in this situation. Let's say we give the elevators a useful life of 25 years, right? So every 25 years, you do a modernization project. In this case, you have an upcoming project that's happening, immediately, basically next fiscal year. So my first question would be, how are you paying for that one, right? If you're going to special assess for that or have a loan to do that, let's say, what we would do in the reserve study is establish the remaining useful life for elevators as 26 years. Okay, so we're basically rolling forward past the initial year and then starting the clock. So we're going to say that 26 years from now is your next elevator modernization project, and you should be putting money in reserves starting now for that eventual timeline. So it looks a little weird on paper, because the remaining life is greater than the useful life, but that's assuming that this immediate project is going to be paid for by some other means. Now, if that's not the case, if you're going to pay for it out of reserves in 2027, then yeah, by all means, we would show useful life of 25, remaining life of 0 to show that that expenditure is coming out of reserves in 2027. So that's really the distinction there, is how are you paying for the immediate project? And then we would determine going forward what you need to do long term. But yes, we would absolutely have funding in there one way or the other.
Okay. Next question. If an asset needs replacing prior to full estimated lifespan, but is part of the reserve and funds are sufficient to replace such asset, can you use the other general money to cover that replacement? The other assumption is that the new asset gets a new life expectancy and the amortization starts again.
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, reserve assumptions for life expectancy are estimates. It's not a crystal ball. So if you need to do something sooner than what was shown in the reserve study, go ahead and do it. And if you should have funds in your reserves to do that, even if it's ahead of schedule, that's fine. This is really the beauty of the pooled method for reserve funds. It's meant to account for those inaccuracies and those differences. Sometimes things happen earlier, sometimes they happen later. When you have one pool of funds that is collectively available for anything on the list, whenever that occurs, you're not worrying about taking money away from something else, right? That should probably end up coming out in the wash. Maybe something you choose to defer another project to offset the difference. And then, yeah, absolutely correct that once you do that, you flip the hourglass back over. You've reset the clock on that thing. Its deterioration cycle begins again, and now you're funding for the next iteration down the line. But yeah, it's okay to use reserve money on something, even if it's happened sooner than you thought.
Next question. Would hurricane cleanup be an item to include in reserves?
It can. Data Steve, why don't you give your thoughts on that, and then I'll back you up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same as we talked about with the lawn and the sod and all that sort of stuff. It's certainly not required by statute. It's probably not something that's traditionally done as a reserve. That to me is more of an operating line item, but it doesn't mean you can't do something like that on a voluntary basis.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that in certain situations, you can use reserve funds for anything you need to if the majority of the membership approves it. And if it's an emergency situation, like you've just been smashed by a hurricane and you've got $100,000 worth of cleanup to do, you can't ignore that, right? You have to do it. If you don't have, a surplus in operating and you've got snowbirds that are scattered all over the world, you might not be able to collect a special assessment. I think the board would have emergency powers there to use reserves for that purpose. If so, they should put the money back, right? You should restore that money as soon as you can. I would not advocate including hurricane cleanup as a routine line item in a reserve study because we don't know the timing of it, right? It's totally unpredictable. If you remember our kind of three-part criteria for what defines a reserve component, one of them is a limited and predictable lifespan. So because we have no idea when your next cleanup project might happen, it's not the best candidate for reserves. To me, this is a really good use of a line of credit, right? If an association has a emergency line of credit, this is a classic case where you would want to use that and then maybe pay down that line with a special assessment or some, spending out of the operating budget to pay it back. But to the extent you can keep your reserves for specifically for routine predictable projects, that's what they're there for.
And don't forget, you should have L&O in your property coverage, which part of that is for removal of damage and cleanup after a storm. So if you do have to use the funds and you're putting in a claim, those funds should be coming back to you from insurance. Martin asks, when should reserves be put in an interest-bearing account at a rate to earn enough to justify paying taxes on the interest and accountant's fees commensurate with that happenstance?
Good question. I guess we'd probably need more information there to decide if the cost benefit is there, but I think it's probably as soon as you've got, even, I mean, $10,000, right, could be earning interest. I think when you put it into an interest-bearing account, you want to be careful to watch out for liquidity, right? You don't want to lock it up in some longer-term investment where the funds might not be available when you need them. So that's my piece of advice when it comes to how to invest reserves is, try not to put the principal at risk. I think that's really kind of the number one golden rule. You can't lose the money. And then make sure that it is available when you need it. So, but as far as where to begin, I think you could probably start at a pretty low dollar amount and still justify that's worth it. It certainly depends on what the taxes are and what the accountant's fees are to make that more accurate. But I would say it's a pretty low number.
Peg, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, be careful the penalties of doing that. So if you have early withdrawal, the penalties might exceed the interest. So, that's the thing you have to really worry about. So
Yeah, I asked Jamie about that myself, about CDs and if you're getting, if the communities have money tied up in CDs for the interest, but then they have to pull that money, CDs are notorious for penalties. And her response to me was they might lose the interest that they earned, but they wouldn't lose the principal. That's the feedback I can give you from Jamie.
okay.
Next, Peter, is there a new law about condo association use of credit cards for day-to-day expenses?
I was doing a quick search. I saw that question and I put it in a quick search, and I'm not coming up with anything, but I do recall that there was some language, and it may have been a proposed bill from several years ago, and I don't offhand recall if it was a restriction on use of credit or debit cards. But Peter, that's something if you want to reach out to me offline, I can look into a little further. I don't have the answer off the top of my head, but I'm not finding it. I'm just doing a really quick search in 20 seconds here. I'm not seeing a new law on that, but it does sound very familiar. Like I've seen that language before. It may have been in a piece of legislation that just never made it through.
Real quickly, somebody was asking about getting the webinar slides. I think we're going to send out a follow-up email with the slides and the copy of the recording, so we'll make that available.
Gina, how do you figure out the inflation factors on reserves?
Yeah, very complicated question, right? So we know inflation is real. Obviously, that's very top of mind for all of us these days, but it's always been a factor, right? If you look back at the last 100 years or so of American history and you slice out any 30-year window of time and you look at the average annual inflation from one year to the next over that 30 years, no matter where you slice the timeline, the average comes out very reliably to about 2.7 to 3%. Okay, so we as a company, we've always felt 3% is a good general number. If I'm telling a client here today, beginning in 2027, here's your cost estimate, but we're going to inflate that each year, we use 3%. Now, when you update a reserve study, that is when you course correct. If inflation has jumped to 5 or 6 or 12% on a particular item, then you need to adjust that cost estimate in the study. So an example that's obviously very relevant for all of us right now would be anything tied to the price of oil. Asphalt products, paint products, a lot of roofing materials can go up and down based on the cost of oil. So if we see a inflationary trend upward on that front, you should be correcting and revising those figures in your reserve study for anything tied to that. So inflation can hit different things at different times, right? In COVID, we saw huge increases for elevators and air conditioning equipment, a lot of stuff that was made overseas because supply chains got interrupted. So it's not a one size fits all number, but as a general rule, something like 3% is a pretty good, round number.
Becky says, our SIRS was totally off for the elevators and we need to replace now and not in 2037. How do we inform owners that we need an assessment?
So a couple of things that are interesting there. The elevators should not have been in the SIRS. Elevators are not a structural integrity item. So maybe the provider did a SIRS and a non-SIRS or a conventional reserve study. That's where the elevators should have been. So that's number one. But if they are occurring now, 10 years roughly earlier than was anticipated, I would just communicate that honestly. I would try to explain to the owners, this is the reality of the situation, right? We are, and I don't know what the approximate cause is. Maybe they're just obsolete. Maybe the manufacturer went out of business and there's no availability to get replacement parts for those things. Maybe it's a code-driven upgrade. The reality is you can't live without an elevator. And the lead time for elevators specifically can be 6 months or more, right? If you just wait until an elevator fails and then decide you're going to modernize it, I don't know if the folks from Clarkson and Varick are still on, but I think in the elevator industry, things take a long time. So this is one where you definitely want to be proactive and not just waiting until they fail. Heard some anecdotal stories in the last couple of months about some 55 and over buildings in Palm Beach County where you had 90-year-old residents effectively stranded on the 6th floor of their buildings because the one elevator serving the building went down. And so that's obviously a very, tough situation for those people, but especially for the board too. If the board could have prevented that, and just allowed it to slide, then I think that would be a big problem. So, just be honest, try to maybe bring in your elevator company, have them give a presentation about what mechanically has caused this to happen. And then maybe try to talk to your SIRS provider and figure out, hey, what happened here? How were you guys off by 10 years? Maybe there's a good explanation for that. Maybe there's not. But I think at the end of the day, the expenses drive the funding plan, not the other way around. You have to do the work when it's required, which may not always be in alignment with whatever was shown in your reserve study.
Okay. During Ian, our restoration contractor required upfront payment equal to the amount of our deductible to begin work. We used reserves to meet the $300,000, which was eventually repaid from owner assessments. Now, with even higher deductibles, we don't have in our operating budget this amount of cash anywhere else. Is it permissible? I guess the question is it permissible to use it from the reserves? And is this a situation where a line of credit would be appropriate?
Steve, I'll let you talk about if that's permissible or not. Whether it's a good idea is a different question, but
I mean, I don't think it's permissible to use the SIRS reserves certainly for that. The question would be whether or not we could use the non-SIRS reserves and maybe get that majority vote of the entire membership for the use of reserves for alternate purposes. Remember, you have the right to either waive or reduce reserves or use reserves for alternate purposes if you get that majority vote of the membership. But again, that's for non-SIRS reserves. So if you have enough reserves in your non-structural reserves to possibly cover some of this expense and you can get a majority vote of the membership, you might be able to defer some of that money over and cover some of those costs.
Okay. Martin says we were told that our insurance deductible amount could not be a reserve item.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I don't know who they were told that by, but it shouldn't be, right? I mean, we have no idea when you're gonna have to pay that deductible, which is why it's not a good candidate to list in your reserve schedule, right? If I just, made a wild guess and I told a client, okay, let's put your insurance deductible in your plan. The very first question is, well, what's the remaining life expectancy? Is it zero? Is it going to happen this year? Is it 5 years from now? Is it 12 years from now? Is it every 3 years from now on forever? Right? Like we have no idea. So that's why it's not a good thing to put in a reserve plan, because once you've done that, you base all of your financial recommendations and calculations around that assumption. So it's yeah, it's just not realistic.
By the way, someone is asking whether or not you can leave the webinar. We've concluded the webinar for the purposes of time that we allotted and for your credit. So yes, if you need to drop off, feel free. There are a few questions left. I don't know if you guys are available to stay a little bit longer or if we want to just answer them maybe and send the answers out with the slides.
Yeah, I can go another maybe 5 minutes or so. I've got a 2 o'clock I need to start getting ready for, but
Yeah.
Okay. How do you figure out the percentage that the reserves or association fee should go up every year?
yeah, well, remember the budget includes operating costs and reserve costs. So the operating side of the budget, I think, is usually pretty straightforward. You're dealing with actual pricing. So if you look at your cable contract and you know what the pricing is going to be for the next year, if that's got a little escalation built into it, you always start with the expenses, right? Whenever you're budgeting. So you would go with your itemized expenses on the operating side. On the reserve side, right? That's where a reserve study is a very useful tool. If you've not had an update done in a while, then maybe you want to at least increase those numbers by 3% as an inflation number. But better to have a professional study done and make sure you're on the right track. So you always begin with the expenses, not with the fees, right? A lot of boards out there or associations out there, I think, try to reverse engineer a budget. They say, we want to keep our dues at 300 a month. So how can we make that work? Well, that's not how it works. You have to start with what do you have to pay for, and then you determine how much to assess your owners for those costs. I always get I see a red alert whenever a building tells me, yeah, we haven't raised our dues in 10 years. So you made it all the way through COVID and all of the hurricanes and all the insurance increases, and you still managed to keep your dues flat. Well, what else? What did you cut then? Right? Because I know a bunch of your costs went up. So you're probably not funding your reserves as much as you should, is usually the takeaway there.
Okay, Steve, I'll leave it to you. Barry's got quite a few questions here. Do you want to pick one that you like to answer?
Well, I think that in general, the question relates to this new the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac issues with the 15%. And I'm certainly not an expert. I'd love to hear Will's thoughts on this, but my understanding of the new regulations.
Yeah, I was going to say, could you explain it for us
Yeah.
little people who don't know?
Yeah, and this is not an obligation for the association to reserve at this level. What this is saying is that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will not offer mortgages. And my understanding is that unless the association has funded reserves, or that the association's funded reserves are at least 15% of the total budget of the association. And I think there's an exception, and I think some of Barry's questions get into the exception of if you're within 3 years, you've done a reserve study and you are funding at the highest level allowable or recommended under that reserve study, and that is under the 15%, then I think you're okay because you're funding at the highest recommended level based on that reserve study and that recent reserve study within the last 3 years. So again, this is not the law does not say an association has to devote 15% of its budget to reserves. What it's saying is that these organizations will not fund mortgages unless you've met those thresholds, and it puts a lot of pressure on associations to meet that because these are very common mortgages and could affect the more the buying and selling market for sure. But yeah, Will, please jump in and give me your thoughts on that.
Agree with all of that. Yeah, I just think it's a really, really big deal. I mean, just I don't know what the number is. I want to say 70% is the number that's sticking in my head about the number of American mortgages that are kind of underwritten by Fannie and Freddie. So it's a massive deal. You're correct. Yeah. One of their underwriting criteria for a long time was at least 10% of the annual budget going to reserves. I think all of the events of the last couple of years, the new legislation, the Champlain Tower South collapse, like all of this has shown a light on the need for reserve funding. And I think the decision makers there said 10% is not enough. We want to see 15%, unless, as you said, unless you have a current and credible reserve study that supports a number lower than that. Now, I will tell you that is unusual for an association to be in a good spot contributing less than 15%. So if anybody out there is thinking, oh, we'll just go get a reserve study done and that's going to be our way to get out from under this, it's highly unlikely that a good reserve study provider is going to arrive at that conclusion for you. What we have found is that for most associations, healthy ones that are funding the reserves properly, that number is more like 15 to 45% of the budget. So 15% in our analysis is actually the low end of the healthy range in terms of the percentage of the budget. So this is fairly new. This all came out within the last month. I think there's gonna be a lot more said and written about it this spring and summer. But yeah, that Fannie and Freddie news is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll unless you guys want to tackle anything else, I'll say that we've concluded our webinar, and if you want to take a stab at any of the Q&A to add to the what we send out to the audience, please feel free. Otherwise, we'll try to have another conversation about this, I'm sure, soon enough.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Peggy, you want to wrap?
Yeah, let me wrap it up. Of course, I want to say thank you, Will. I get a lot of positive comments in the Q&A in the chat section about how precise the information is. I guess people are looking for that, and that's kind of how I advertised it, to get details from you. So thank you for that. Steve, thank you so much, and Daniel as well. Thank you, sponsors. CAMS, for not just getting on because you needed credit. I'm sure a lot of you stayed on. I was looking at the numbers. And board members, thank you for trying to stay up on top of this. It's very important for the real estate part of these condominiums to stay afloat, and also that you guys always have money in emergencies. So I do have a few things coming up. I'm going to start with April 30th. We've got the next webinar coming in for Best Roofing is going to talk about hurricane preparedness, but this time they're going to have a panel. So very excited. It's a 2-hour presentation from 12 to 2. May the 8th is my next construction summit. We have had some extraordinary industry people on. We had Epic Forensic Engineering last week. We also had attorney from Baljanik, a construction attorney, and we're also had Colliers. So very important information being given regarding construction. So if you have a project or so on, May the 8th is the next one. May 12th, we have the paving lady coming in. They're going to be giving an updated presentation on everything you wanted to know about paving. And then on May 19th, I have a Hurricane Huddle event coming up. It's Huddle Up and Hunker Down. Daniel Baum and I have started this last year. We're going to have a nice guest speaker and 2 boards this year. The first the first panel is going to be board members. I'm looking for board members in the Palm Beach County area that would like to sit on to the board and have a conversation. If I have to do 2 sets of a panel for that, we have 30 minutes with Jane Boland. She's going to speak to the issues, not just a hurricane, but if you have questions and so on to discuss for board members. And then we also are going to have our second panel after the keynote speaker. It's industry leaders. Daniel is going to be the moderator, and we're going to have a public adjuster. We'll have an attorney. We'll have restoration contact on there, engineer, and also roofer. So I hope you guys can come. It's going to include free lunch, door prizes, and lots of networking. 5/26, I've got another coffee with the county, so hopefully we have some more conversation on safety tips and things that are going out at your community with the Palm Beach County Emergency Management Team. Animal Control had it last time, so let's see who is going to come in, the fire department and so on. May 29th, I've got Dan Wasserstein coming in, very local Eastern attorneys. He's going to speak on fining. That's a Friday. We're going to do that in the morning from 10 to 11:30. So lots of information regarding fining that as it relates to your reserves too. I will send out a sponsor sheet. As I mentioned, I have a couple that I need to get out prior to other webinars. I went on vacation a couple weeks, so just getting back this week. So look for your sponsor sheets for the last couple of webinars. And hope to see you on the 30th with Best Roofing. And until then, please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks, Peggy. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much. See you next time.
Thanks,
Okay,
Will.
bye-bye.
Thanks, Steve.
Bye.
Mhm.